Jelka is a housing project in Linci. We're living here in a house that we're still renting right now, but we want to buy it together, and we don't want to buy it with our own money, but we want to like not make it our property, but to make it like a collective housing project which stays like a collective house forever. Willy Fred in Linci and also we. It's two projects which are similar in the way that it was just a house which was there, which was on the market, and the house is bought. But there are also already other kind of HabiTAT projects. So in Vienna there's a group and they just built a house. So they also made it in the same way with collecting direct loans and stuff, but they just in a new district of Vienna, there was like this district where there are a lot of houses built right now, and they built also a house there and financed it in the way of HabiTAT and also made it a HabiTAT project. So they are very different projects. And then in some projects you have this pressure of time that you really have to get the money very fast and buy the house fast.
The very hopeful idea is that this will also affect the prices for other people in other houses.
And also the idea is like of HabiTAT to like grow, and if there are more projects, at some points there will be like older projects where the rent is already very low and where direct loans could be already paid back.
And we on the other hand were very lucky because there was this group that wanted to start a housing project, and they had just the idea and talked to Willy Fred people, and the person who got this house,
she inherited it.
She inherited
3 years
it,
ago,
and she doesn't want to be a house owner and said she wants to sell it to a housing group. Yeah, I heard that things like housing projects existed, and I found it super interesting and started reading. And then I moved to Linz and I was searching for a flat and heard that there is an existing housing project, and when I was looking it up I heard that there is a new one that is currently starting. And I thought it would be so nice to be in this process and see how everything of this works, and how you can even buy a house. Because normally when you don't come from a rich family, you don't think about things like buying houses. So there's a lot of things that you can learn and a lot of things that you can achieve in the group. And it was like the idea of the process and doing this and freeing a house that was very attractive.
Just the idea of like collective living, and also I think like living or like the private is always political. It's like a saying in German, and I think that fits very well. And I like how with being in a housing project you can combine that very well. And for me, solidarity, for example, in society is a very important value, and I just like it very much how we really live here together and try to share resources. Like maybe we don't need like 5 vacuum cleaners in this house, just as a very easy example, but can just share things, and which is not done in normal like houses where there are different flats and people live there. And we try to really like share resources and also to organize together, also take the step of putting the house away from the market to free at least this one house. I mean, it won't be every house now, and it's still a very little bubble and a little step we do here, but I think it's important to show that this is also a model which is possible and this can be done, and this is also a way of living together and of organizing.
I was looking for a place to stay during my Erasmus time, and I preferred something like a house project, and So I made internet research, and friends of mine told me about this project.
I've been here from the beginning, so I thought about this a lot before, that I would at some point want to live with others in a house project or something similar. But I would have never thought that this was possible in Linz, because of it being a really small town and not too much of an active political scene here. And then there was a text message from Caesar, who actually started the whole thing, and I hardly knew her, and she was like, yeah, there is a meeting to create a house project in Linz if I want to come. And I was like, wow, yeah, I definitely want to. And that was the beginning, and then from that it took off.
HabiTAT is like a bigger structure in Austria. It's like an idea of how to manage housing projects, of how to found housing projects maybe.
Yeah, or how to free them and how to finance them.
And there's a very clever model already to that. It was first founded in Germany with Mietshäuser-Syndikat, and they have a lot of projects already. And in 2015, I think, in Austria, the first people started also to implement this idea here, and they founded HabiTAT. Yeah, and the idea of HabiTAT projects is to make sure the houses can never be sold again. And the way we do that is that the Hausverein, so in our case it's Jelka, it's our single Hausverein, is gonna make a GmbH. It's all a bit hard to explain in English, but it's this company which owns then the house, is owned to 51% of the Hausverein group. So this makes sure it's more than half, so the group living in the house can autonomously just make decisions and autonomously decide what they do or what we do here in our house, and how we want to, renovate it, how we want to live together, etc. That's things we can just decide on our own without having to ask all HabiTAT for it. But the important thing is that HabiTAT, so the general structure of Austria, also owns 49% of it. And this just makes it impossible to be sold, because if we want to sell the house, that's a big decision. And then HabiTAT would also have to give their okay, which they would never do, because that's the idea of HabiTAT projects, that they are not just sold because the group, moves out or whatever happens, that just should stay a HabiTAT project forever. So it doesn't go back to the market where we want to take it from.
You're confronted with a lot of different dynamics that you can't really get out of, because you're working inside the system. It's not a squad. We are not rightfully grabbing space. We are paying for it, and we are paying this money, for example, to other people who maybe inherited a house and have actually no right to owning a place like this. But we pay them money to get the house from them, and we pay this money off with our rents. That is basically the money we earn. So it's not fair in a way, but it's a pragmatic approach to free some parts, houses, from this capitalist dynamic. And I think it's worth it, but it's messy. And the good thing about that marketing thing that I talked about earlier is you have to talk to people, you have to explain it to them, and then you have to also explain it to your grandmother or your mom or your aunt, or I don't know. And that's interesting, because you are leaving that hypothetical, theoretical space of the marginalist radical left usually inhabiting. And you're going that extra step, stepping into uncharted terrain and actually trying to build something. And that's always going to be messy, and you automatically cross that boundary between you and regular people, and become more approachable. That's what I think.
We are our own landlords. It's not as of the money that we pay for renting. We are deciding what is happening with it. In the beginning, this money is of course used to buy the price, buy the house, and to give the money back to the people who gave us the money. It's simply the people that are living here are deciding what is happening and what is not happening. And also, if we think about what we want to do, we also decide how high the price is and how much we want to pay. How much luxury do we want, or is it more important to live very cheaply? And this is decided in the group together and not by one person somewhere on top that you can't reach, that has somehow got a lot of money and is now, because of that, able to make these decisions for you.
In the beginning, it was really like nobody from the group actually knew that much about buying houses or like owning houses or like the real estate market or all the legal stuff that's involved in the whole thing. So the first year was pretty much getting the know-how, like inviting people from Germany, from the Mietshäuser-Syndikat. They have been like really helpful with sharing their ideas and their knowledge for free. And we made a lot of mistakes. Like we assumed completely wrong things, and then we thought that things are a little bit different than we assumed in the beginning and stuff like that. And we started to look at houses and to get a general gist of how much a house costs and what's feasible for us. We started calculating that's the price, that would be the rent. Is that too much and stuff like that? And we started to get to know people who have houses. Basically, yes. And that was the first year, and then we found the house, and then the second year was the whole process of getting the legal framework done and buying the house. The group was first, but the group changed a lot. That's pretty much the same for all the groups I know of. They start, and then at some point, at least sometimes or oftentimes, half of the group leaves because they have like different goals, and then new people join. So it's very volatile in the beginning, usually.
The first people from Jelka moved in this house in October 2019, so it was not too long ago. But it was only 2 flats then, so it was. I think it was 6 people moving or 5 people moving in at first, and a lot of things in the house were not ready yet. So in this flat where we are right now, there had to be a lot renovated, still the floors had to be done, etc., etc. So it was like a process to renovate it and move in. And it's not only about living, so we also want to really promote our principles here, which is like solidarity and equality. And we have, for example, also our room. We also pay it, like the people who live here. And it's a room which can be used by groups which want to do political activism, who want to, I don't know, just meet up for organizing a food sharing event or
theater groups or German classes for immigrants.
So the room is quite full of possibilities because it's not too full of like things and can be used in a lot of different ways. And by that we want to also just give people space in Linz who don't have space. So it's very often for groups who want to do something that they really have energy and motivation, but they don't have like the financial possibilities to do what they want to do, and they can't like rent some office for themselves. And that's our idea, that this room can be used by groups, and we like finance it. And of course we take like solidarity money if a group has money, but it can be used also for free if a group doesn't have any money.
And for the house project, it's a very easy answer because this was the first house project like this in Austria, and so they all are related to here, and maybe it's getting less, but they are not that much at the moment, so it is like this.
Yeah, it's always hard to tell because, for example, the free shop downstairs is a thing that wouldn't be there without the house project. But it was kind of started by people from the house, but because there was room for it and we could like lower the cost of the room so much that we could do a free shop there, and it enabled already existing initiatives, I would say, more than like really inspired new ones. But that it definitely did. There was, for example, das Kollektiv, who runs the education association downstairs. They had really problems with finding space to actually have their classes in Linz, because landlords were like, okay, if there are 100 migrants coming in and out every day, it lowers the value of my property. You know, that's the logic of capitalism, and so they wouldn't rent out the space, or they were kicked out a couple of times and stuff. And here, that's not our problem. Like the value of the property is non-existent anymore because it can't be sold anymore. And then there's bits and bobs, like small things, like we have a basement where there are private concerts from the local music scene, usually not in Corona times. And the common rooms are shared with other people to hold their plenaries there or their gatherings.
There's also a lot of work to do in a housing project. We have to have our finances right, we have to have all the contracts for energy and gas and whatever. We have to see that the legal structure of the Verein is done right. There are just a lot of different things that just have to happen. And we like splitted those in responsibilities, and it's like AGs, so like working groups, who are just responsible for one thing or for something special, and we coordinate this in a plenum, and a plenum happens every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks we just meet all the people, so we're only 8, so all or everyone who has time, we meet up and we coordinate in plenum what does which AG, what happens in the house right now, and also if there are decisions to be made, then we also make them together at plenum. Like, of course, also the AGs, so the working groups, can decide things because otherwise everything would go very slow. That's important that just if a person takes responsibility for something, they can also decide things.
And also of constantly trying to improve it and improve the way we live together and see what works, what doesn't work. So it's also a lot of evaluation and trying to find out what we need, or trying to find out what is missing or what could be helpful for the group or for the housing project. And the good thing is that since we are more people deciding together, there are also most of the times more ideas, and I think you can get to better solutions if you get through different ideas and different ways of thinking, and together you decide which one is fitting best.
Because it's really difficult to spread the responsibilities. There is this kind of founding member thing that are emotionally more involved than people who move in later, in general, not in every case. And those people who like have more responsibilities are not that eager to give them away. They're clinging to responsibilities, and new people are maybe not confident enough in the beginning to take on responsibilities. So we try to cut it in really small bites and have like this small responsibilities be done by 2 people usually. I think there is responsibilities that need some kind of know-how, knowledge or training, also like all this financial stuff, and usually like roles that need a certain kind of reliability, where they have to be done like every week, constantly. It's hard to find people to do that.
I think it starts at around 1 million for small houses, and yeah, it can get a lot and very expensive. I know that the bigger projects sometimes struggle to do it only with direct loans, and that they also need bank credits, which are more expensive. So you can feel it in the rents that you need it.
And here, like, we probably have to collect around 1 million direct loans. We haven't decided, like, it's an exciting time now for us, because we are soon gonna start this whole project we want to soon like found this company with which we can then start to also raise the money and like start collecting direct loans from people. And we also don't know yet if we can get all the money by direct loans, or if we need like part of direct loans and maybe also part of money from the bank. That's something we still have to decide, and which is not decided yet. So there are different HabiTAT projects. Some did it without the bank at all, some split it somehow.
We are talking about really big sums of money. We are moving around every year. Like we have like income for the project 150,000 euros every year. The whole house was more than 3 million euros with everything included. And so trusting that everything is just fine is a challenge. But also it's a challenge to take it on. But I think one of the most emancipating maybe or like empowering things about doing a project like this is getting rid of that anxiety or that respect for money, because when you need 3 million euros, like in the beginning we were like, that's an unimaginable amount of money, and like also like doing online banking transactions with like millions of euros is completely weird. But it also gives you that perspective about how capitalists do it, you know, like they don't think about money too much because they just get it from the bank and they invest it. And when I used to work in like really small, maybe political activist groups, and we had to turn on like every euro and see where to spend it, and it was always like money was a scarcity. And then this project came about, and like if you have 150,000 euros of income every year, it's a collective. Like if something is broken and we need 1,000 euros, it's not a problem. We don't really have to think about it, and then this creates a lot of opportunities and like to take on things differently.
The house is bought from the owner, but there are still a lot of bank loans. Yeah, and I don't know for how many years is it planned.
Like we are gonna pay. We have to pay it off over 30 years, basically.
Okay.
So it's not paid off yet, and we are still paying that with our rent. Like we stretched it as far as it gets to have actually really cheap rent. But still, the money goes to the former owner and a little bit to the bank, and then there is this other part that was borrowed from like private people. Yeah. But you're talking about the Solidarity Fund, and that's after 30 years, maybe a little longer, because at some point we have maybe get a new bank loan to fix the roof or something, bigger investment. But after a while it's gonna be paid off, and then we didn't want to create these islands of happiness that don't relate to society anymore, where like very few people could live for almost free and then the rest does not. So we have the solidarity fund. So while the money we have to pay off the loans gets less, the solidarity fund gets more. So it's gonna be really cheap in 30 years from now, really, really cheap, but it's not gonna be for free. And the difference, like the solidarity fund, goes into HabiTAT, the umbrella association, is then used to help start new projects and to free more and more houses from the market system.
I'm working in a counseling center, and we very often have the case that people just need a new flat because they have to move out of their old flat or anything, and right now it's just horrible because you can't really find flats, and if you find them they are just very expensive, which is just especially for people who like are not super rich or people who just don't have the best financial background. It's almost impossible right now in Linz to find a flat. The idea is that in Austria there is also for poor people, so people who have a certain income or don't reach a certain income, they get support to pay their rent, for example. But then there's also this rule that if you want to get this support to pay your rent, the price of your flat can't be higher than a certain amount per square meter. I think it's around €7 or something per square meter. And if the price is higher, you just can't get this support. And the problem is the prices are higher all the time right now. And so you can't then even get this support if you're poor, because there's just no flat where you could apply for this.
In Austria, we have also like this advantage that we have a pretty big state-run housing sector or non-profit housing sector. It's kind of mixed. It's this big, huge cooperatives that own and build a lot of houses. And you can apply for a flat there, and after like 2 years of waiting time, you will probably get one that's kind of cheap. They are declining, so it's shifting towards private investment also in Austria. So it's getting more and more hard or tough to get a flat like this. And also these huge cooperatives, they don't really think about individual people. Like they build these huge blocks. They have this idea of there is an average family. Like they create, like flats for the average family or maybe for the average single, and like they work with these averages. And if you look at houses built by them, they are like dead. At least that's my view on it. And you are they limit even the color of the sunshade on your balcony to a certain amount of colors and stuff like that. It's really stupid. And if you look at projects like ours, especially at those in Germany that have been there for like 10 or 20 years, you see how like organically they grow. Like there is a small like outside balcony like added there, and then there is a sunroof, or there is a new ecological heating system. So it really like grows to the needs of the tenants, and it's not this huge top-down, very like old social democratic approach where like the society is planned by people who know what's best for you.
The thing which makes complication is I would say not really the government, but just the people who like the housing market itself. Because if there is like a house free that could be like bought by a HabiTAT project, and if like a project, for example, wants to buy this house, a person maybe wants to sell it in some weeks or a month, and that's a bit the problem with some HabiTAT project, because then you just have to get the money very fast. So that's also how we are in a very privileged situation here in our house. We're right now renting it, and the house owner really also likes the idea of having this project here. she wants to sell it to us.
Most of the houses that are newly built with a lot of flats are very high-priced houses. Like in Urfa, they are building huge towers, but they're all super expensive and fancy flats for rich people. And I don't think, or I don't know if there are any housing, as a construction projects for cheap housing. So it's mainly for, it's mainly for luxury. I mean, there's a lot of empty houses in all of the cities, and it would be just dumb to not live in there, because the space is here. There are people here who need the living, and I think it's an obvious solution to move into the existing houses instead of building new ones, because it's super not environmentally friendly to build new ones. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and it's mostly not necessary. I mean, around here, the neighbor house is an empty one, for instance, so there could be easily, I don't know how many space there's, but it's a lot. It's bigger than our house, and it would be an easy solution to just moving into existing houses for a lot of problems. But yeah, sometimes the people who own the houses just buy them or sell them, so they can speculate with it, that the price is getting higher, and that for them they make more profit if they don't sell it than if they for a time until the prices are getting high, and then they make luxury renovations and then sell it at a very high price. So right now the development is because of that there are a lot of empty houses, and in general the prices are getting higher, and that's why it's really you should just open these houses and let people move in.
I think that the problem with housing is oftentimes organization. It's really hard to reuse an old house, to refurbish it and to renovate it and stuff like that, and to think about what to do with it, but then to just plan it on a sketchboard and build it in a completely new way. And I think that's what developers are afraid of. It's not as plannable. You can't plan, if you build a new house on a certain land, you can really plan on how much you get out of it, your return on investment, and it's very secure, and you would need a group like us to actually live in the house and to see what can be done and to renovate it in that way. And nobody has the organizational resources to do so. The state does not, the cities, the municipalities do not. So they want to get rid of all this responsibility because they don't know a way how to organize it. So they outsourcing it to private investors. I think organization is really a big key in this. Also, in Berlin, for example, there is this new government that tried to buy houses using their right as a city to, if someone wants to buy a house, the city can jump in and say, now we are buying it at the same price, of course. And their problem was not money, because the state can come up with money, that's not the problem. The problem was they couldn't organize it. They didn't have the organizational structures to becoming this kind of a landlord and then dealing with all those people. So they had a lot of requests by actual tenants who got to know that their house was sold, and they had the money but they couldn't organize it, because we got rid of all these structures that we need to organize us as a society, because we all outsource it all to corporations, and they are having their profit view on things, and magic, it works, but it doesn't work in a good way.
Yeah, I think it's also about a vision to renovate the house and to keep old houses, which are maybe from the substance much more long lasting than building a new one. but the benefits come so much later, or maybe has nothing to do with you anymore. So, but of course it's also about political decisions. But I think this is also something which is very helpful for renovating instead of building new.
Linz has the kind of advantage for us that it's, compared to the other bigger cities in Austria, it's not that heated. Like the real estate market is not that heated. It's getting more and more expensive, like everywhere else. And the prices are like in fantasy land already. So it's getting harder and harder for us to actually buy houses and refinance them over time with rent, because it's become more and more a speculative asset for people with a lot of money. And that's the same in Linz. Prices are rising, and for us that's, at least for particularly us and our project, that's not too bad, because our prices stay the same, so we are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, but only compared to all the others, and that's not a very good thing. So it's getting more difficult also in a way that it used to be that like individual people owned like houses like this, their families would own them and they rented it out, and they had like this personal relationship with their tenants, and that's going away really quickly. Like a lot of like big investors grabbing all the houses, and big investors are really hard to work with because they only see the money, and that's also hard to deal with if you found a project like this. There used to be a guide that we created, but it's we have to print it again. It's not there right now. But like had a step by step, basically, or at least we tried, because it's not that easy. We found, for us, the group was first, and then we searched for a house, and then we had this whole process of buying it. But there's a new project in Vienna that was created a couple of weeks back. That's actually the tenants of an already existing house. Like they got to know that their house is going to be sold by its current owner, and they are trying to buy their house they're already living in. So, and there is this other thing where like houses are built from scratch. This whole Baugruppen scene in Austria, it's called that way. And so there's very many different approaches, and it's always hard to say where to start. But I think best is to start with a group, and then you just start actually, like if you start looking for houses, it's better to start looking and really like do something than talk like 2 years about how you dream about the project, because then like at the first visit of an actual house, like all the dreams are becoming like more concrete and they shatter. Yeah, selling it is literally impossible, because every inhabitant of every project in Austria and Germany would need to say yes.
In Germany too.
Because Mietshäuser-Syndikat is a member of HabiTAT.
Yeah, okay.
So that's out of the question. The only way it could, like the government taking it away from us, can always happen if there is some kind of a right-wing coup, and you never know. But we fight with the weapons of capitalists, and the good thing about it is property, the right of property is like the holy grail, it's sacred, you know, like taking that away is really, really difficult. And we have this property title, and so the only real way of us losing the house would be to go bankrupt, which is also really, really difficult, you know. So it's, like from the outside it may appear that it's really hard to run a house like this and like to keep everything balanced, but our house is getting more and more value just by market dynamics, and also because we improve it And at the same time, we are getting like rid of the loans bit by bit. So we actually, every year it's gonna be safer than the year before, and we're already 5 years in. So from a financial perspective, I can't think of a way how to lose this house other than like, even if we want to, it would be hard.
I mean, I think it's very important that it is possible. If you don't have money on your own, it's possible to buy a house and to build this your own version of living and your own utopia, if you want to call it like that. So I mean, it's a hard process and it can be very difficult, but it is possible and it's very rewarding, and you can build something very unique and very beautiful, and it's not just to do something, it's you're creating the environment for your own life.